the type of AI which we think is going to be most impactful to supply chains sits closer to what used to be kind of optimization. So actually the critical thing to understand in supply chain context when you're talking about AI is that what you're really looking for is a blend of capability in the underlying technology, because you need a software solution that isn't just throwing one technology at the problem. It needs to be able to both have a framework to try different technologies and apply them and switch between them and balance them at different levels of scale. In some cases, the best answer is best achieved by letting a model run for a very long time and just brute forcing through all the different permutations. And in a lot of cases, that will be computationally infeasible. And so you need to be able to use a different technology that will approximate the same outcome and get you as close to it. The thing you're really trying to test for is ultimately how does this perform versus a group of people doing it, and what's the trade-off that I get there.
Launch sequence activated.
Hello and welcome to the Maersk Growth Podcast, a podcast that takes you on an open-ended exploration of the most transformative trends and latest insights into supply chain technology. The podcast is brought to you by Maersk Growth, the venture arm of A.P. Møller Maersk. In the podcast, we will dive into the venture ecosystem and bring you interviews with founders, experts, and other interesting guests, discussing the most interesting ideas, developments, and the people behind them. My name is Jannik Pedersen, and I will be your host today. As always, if you are a startup working on digitizing, democratizing, or decarbonizing global supply chains and are interested in collaboration, please reach out to us at growth@maersk.com or visit our website, maersk.com/growth. So sit back, relax, and join us on this journey as we explore supply chain technology and startups. Welcome to this episode of the Maersk Growth Podcast. Today we have a very exciting guest from one of our portfolio companies, Phil Ashton of 7bridges. So I'm very excited to welcome you here today. So welcome, Phil.
Thank you very much. Great to be here. Very excited.
And how are you today?
Doing very well. Working around Europe, trying to dodge all the colds and flus at the moment, but doing well otherwise. Thanks.
Perfect. That I'm happy to hear. So maybe if we just kick off very high level with a personal introduction to you and how you ended up founding 7bridges.
Sure. Yeah. So I spent a few years working in a company called World Courier, and that happened by pure happenstance. I was working at a management consulting firm. One of the partners moved over, took up one of the roles leading the firm, leading World Courier, and was looking for somebody to come over and help him with the data there. And he invited me over, and it stuck. Basically, once I got there, I couldn't leave. And there was just a huge amount of both great people to work with that I found in the supply chain world, but also a huge amount of information and data that could be used in really interesting ways and really powerful ways. So there was just a lot of work that I got stuck into. And in the course of doing that, I found that there was actually kind of an underlying problem that a lot of the businesses that consume logistics services depend on logistics providers struggled with, which was fundamentally their ability to kind of orchestrate their supply chains to meet business level objectives. So rather than thinking about the things that you might tweak within your own supply chain, like fill rates and consolidation, load factors, and so on, connecting that to questions like margin, service level, sales targets, and so on, was actually extremely complicated for them. And the underlying information was available, just distributed across a lot of parties. And the underlying maths was possible, just very difficult to make that kind of connection and start thinking from an outcome-driven perspective rather than playing forward from the point of manufacture and thinking about a stepwise view, an activity-driven view of the supply chain. I saw that challenge and that trend, and actually the more I explored it directly with businesses that I just had repeated across every single industry, whether that was in pharmaceuticals or retail and automotive, just kept on hearing the same underlying problem. We can't really orchestrate the supply chain to hit these outcomes. We can't build things around an outcome-driven view of things, of the supply chain of the business that we'd like to build, because fundamentally we don't have a set of data that we can actually make the decisions off the back of. So we're always forced into quite siloed thinking. We have to solve whatever problem is right in front of us and we can understand immediately. And so that's where we started the idea of 7bridges. So quite early on, got my co-founder Mate, who comes from a background at IBM. He's got a big data and data science kind of expertise, and he's been looking at problems like this, these kind of data-driven problems from the start. And actually, the first time I kind of introduced this concept to him, he basically didn't believe me that this could be a problem in the modern world. It's one of those things that feels like it should have been solved back for a long time ago. And we had a really nice experience where we went out and got our first customer and got the data from it. And Matthew was still a little skeptical, even though I showed him a lot of evidence. And he looked at the data and came back to me a few days later and said, the problem's much worse than you told me. There's a lot more to do than I thought.
But I guess that
was the genesis.
A lot of people have when they thought of starting, come outside into supply chain, then they actually experience the state and sort of the silos and so on. But I guess that was really sort of the inflection point to founding 7bridges. Can you then just walk us through very high level what is exactly you're building and what are sort of the problems you're trying to solve?
Yeah, so what we're building starts from this premise of we believe it's possible to build outcome-driven supply chains, and to do that, essentially, you need to build a smart layer of data underneath your supply chain, connecting it kind of end-to-end. So the things we actually build break down really into 3 layers or capabilities that we work to provide with businesses. They are a data layer that takes data across all of the supply chain inputs we have across all our businesses. So it builds this kind of image of what the supply chain looks like, the logistics networks that connect consumers, distributors, retailers, manufacturers, and so on. That data layer and the specific things that will affect the businesses that sit on that. So whether that's, the contracts they've signed, the costs that they have, through to the service levels that they're experiencing. So on the one hand, we have that data layer. And then on top of that, to actually connect it to your outcomes, you need to be able to do some pretty complicated maths to work backwards from some fairly nuanced views of balancing. Let's balance a few things. Let's balance our carbon output, our carbon emissions. Let's balance our gross margins. Let's balance our service levels to customers. We want to optimize all those things to hit different targets. They're competing with each other. We need to work that out, but we also need to work that out in the context of what could change in the supply chain, what disruptions you could see. And we need to take some probability-driven views of scenarios that might be relevant to us. We're going to blend all that together and then make a decision about how we should build the right supply chain, and then actually how we should operate it on the ongoing basis. So our second capability does the maths behind that for building and planning the supply chain. And our third capability is designed to kind of keep you on track. It's an automation layer that actually takes input from the simulation layer that sits on top of that data. It says, this is how we think you should build the supply chain. Here are all the options, and allows you to put the output of that simulation, those simulations, into what you're actually doing. How the supply chain actually runs and drives the decision making in real time. So you have a closed loop by the end of this of being able to see what's happening in the supply chain, understand what is going to happen and what could happen if you changed any one parameter, and then being able to put that into the real world and say, well, in that case, we're going to make these transport decisions, these storage decisions, position inventory at this location, and so on.
Yeah, no, very interesting. And of course, we will come back to some of the more granular functionality of the platform. But maybe just starting the first sentence were around sort of outcome-based supply chains. That's really where we want to go versus activity-based supply chains. Can you just give sort of very conceptual view on what that means for you and what are really sort of the typical outcomes you work with your customers around?
Yeah. So conceptually, the way a supply chain should work, there should be a part of the business which thinks about what demand we're generating, what demand we're going to see, and then a part of the business which essentially sits and responds to that demand and says, well, how do I best meet it? And the question of how you best meet it depends on what the nature of your strategy is, what the nature of your customers are, and so on. So there could be many different variations, and really no business is alike in that respect. They always have different channels that they want to work over and different geographies and so on. So you've got to be able to think about conceptually putting those different parameters in, whether that's a revenue target in a geography, and then also by product and into a particular type of segment of the market, what you would want to see from a service level, and then have your supply chain actually work out how best to meet that demand. At the moment, the easiest way to do that would be to throw a lot of people at the problem and try and get them to think it through. And you've got really good people in the supply chain who can do this, but they do it basically blind. They don't have much information about what will happen. So conceptually, you want to drive it off your data, and there's a lot of information out there about how the supply chain should work. Activity-driven supply chains, by contrast, typically focus on the parts of the supply chain that you can already understand and kind of just take for granted or try to predict what that might lead to towards the end of a supply chain. So you might think about things in terms of what fill rates or load factors we can try and optimize at different parts, which may have a material impact on cost and service levels. But trying to predict forward how that's going to cascade all the way through your supply chain to the end outcome you want to, which might be a sales target, meeting a sales target, is something which is actually generally very, very difficult to do if you haven't got that underlying data set and you haven't actually thought about why am I trying to achieve that. It really shouldn't be the point. The point should be I'm trying to meet these business objectives, and the load factor is something I vary depending on how that best allows me to meet the business objectives.
Yeah, no, mate, totally sense. And maybe just to exemplify this even more, can you give like a customer example or like a particular use case for a vertical of customers where sort of we see this in action through your platform and your capabilities?
Sure, yeah. So, there are good examples of this in healthcare supply chains where they ultimately have a variety of different end customers that they might need to supply product to, and the nature of that demand therefore is quite different. So whether that's sending into clinics on a regular repeat prescriptions for a customer where you actually have pretty good understanding upfront, you have good understanding of when that drug is going to need to be consumed. And so ultimately what you're trying to say is I want really very high reliability that person has their prescription on time, but actually I've got quite a lot of different ways I can get it to them if I know a long way in advance. So I may want to maximize the reliability and then look to minimize the cost. Then we might want to set a constraint around that, a factor around that. But by contrast, you also have patients who may come to you with urgent demands for medication, which may go direct to them, may go via a hospital, may go via a clinician, which you have very limited warning about. And for them, everything is about speed and urgency and reliability, and the cost question becomes possibly almost irrelevant. And so the nature of those two demands, on a business by segment, is completely different. You may need to still use the same supply chain you've got. You may not be able to build an entirely new supply chain just for that use case, or you may have to. But the answer should be in your data. It should be possible to tell you whether you're able to meet your current customers' demand and in both channels and both segments, and using the infrastructure you've got, and how best to do that, and actually see what transport methods and where to position inventory to achieve that total outcome for your customer.
Yeah, and now you mentioned the healthcare example. Sort of how agnostic is your platform in terms of the customer verticals? Who is really sort of the key customers and personas you are after?
So at the moment we're targeting health and fashion retail and some distributors of in those verticals and high tech. And the actual platform is pretty vertical agnostic because the underlying technology is about the underlying data layer of the supply chain. So we actually have a lot of information about things which are completely agnostic to industry. A port doesn't care if you're a car or a drug coming into it. It's still a port. It still has certain ways of operating, and that's the data that we're collecting about how that port's going to function. So when you're building the picture, you're pretty agnostic. Then within that, you do see vertical segmentation. So, for example, food and drink suppliers are quite different to the suppliers that you're going to see in the automotive industry. So there are concentrations that we try to focus on in order to best give customers the best impact. So we try and go vertical by vertical to them. But the actual technology itself is very agnostic to the vertical.
Yeah. Okay. Very interesting. Sort of when I conceptually think about your product and your platform, I really think about like a supply chain brain. That's sort of the image I get into my head. Then sort of the first part of that, at least for me, it's around the sensing, the visibility and so on. And I think visibility was probably the supply chain buzzword of 2022. Can you elaborate a little bit on sort of how your platform is, first of all, addressing that and providing visibility to the customers?
Yeah, I think that's some really good points. So visibility is one of those slippery concepts. And what it means to any given supply chain is very different. And there are core sets of data which are always going to be of interest. But again, this is going to come back to what objective are we trying to achieve? Whenever a customer comes into us and says the problem we've got is visibility, when you dig a little bit deeper, that's not fundamentally the problem. Fundamentally, the problem will be something to do with we can't find inventory that we need at the time that we need it in order to meet customer demand. So we're missing revenue. And so the so what is actually usually something much more specific than just inventory. And there's a general sense that visibility is the underlying cause of this challenge. So when we think about visibility, we're always going back to outcomes. What are the outcomes that you're ultimately going to try and drive towards it? Because then that tells you what data you're actually going to need. And yes, there may be data that's already sitting outside the path to the outcome that you probably do also need to get, because the outcomes are quite specific and there's more complexity of nuance to that. So there's kind of two views you take on it. What do I need from an outcome perspective? So pharmaceuticals are very often going to hear things like it's important to have my understanding of the quality control around the product, which usually means that you may have to have temperature control data in order to actually understand any drug that's got a temperature control component to it, or the biologics, for example. You do need to know whether that product has been kept in the right temperature range in order to understand whether the quality outcome that you want to have has been met. That's a key data set you need to pull together, completely irrelevant for fashion. Now, obviously, nobody would kind of think about that, but by contrast, the tracking information, you might see that the event data tells you where a shipment progresses through it. Often a huge focus for businesses. It's actually not always relevant. It's useful, it's important to know that your inventory is in progress and in transit. But in most scenarios, what you're really asking is what inventory is available to promise. And that really depends on the context of your overall demand picture. Do you have a dynamic, complex demand picture, or do you have a highly predictable one? Because the answer in a lot of cases is going to be, actually, we've got a mixture. In this segment, it's really, really volatile. And it may be the case that tracking isn't going to solve anything. You just watch more of your inventory go out the door and get stuck and not be available when you need it to. And actually, the fundamental thing you need to be thinking about is changing your transport modes. So at a high level, visibility is one of these things that always has to be brought back to what's my impact and how am I going to deliver it. Our perspective on this has always been visibility for visibility's sake, often hugely overpromises and delivers to a customer. And actually, ultimately, what you need to find is something which is going to drive immediate value off the data that you're going to collect. And that can start with everything from all of the cost data, all of the event data, all of the device data, contracts, all of these things can give you a visibility picture. But to what end is the underlying point?
Yeah. That fully makes sense and sort of following the outcomes in that sense. Maybe you could just give some examples. What are sort of the typical systems, both with the shipper and maybe externally sort of integrate to get this data layer in order and of course follow these outcomes?
Yeah, well, I mean, let's continue the example of a pharmaceutical company or a drug distribution company. So in those cases, very often what you've got is some deadline that you're trying to meet one from a delivery perspective. So in order to get that, you need, on the customer side, you're typically going to the ERP or something equivalent that contains the order information and contains things like the concept set, the due dates. And that's critical information because that's what's going to set your specific objective for that individual order. And then as a result, you're obviously definitely going to need information that allows you to build up a concept of the transit times and the total time to fulfill the order from the point of order. So that's, you've got to go from order to pick, pack, ship, and then ship through to end customer. And actually, if you're thinking proactively about this, what you're immediately going to say is, well, what's the gap between inventory, where it sits currently in the world, and the demand that we typically see over a period? So you want to think proactively about that. So in that case, you're actually going to build a forecast of demand, as well as take the current demand, and then look at your ability to supply it based on your current inventory. So those are key data sets that are going to come out of the ERP. And then on the transport side, you're going to need the availability, the ability to deliver, the timeframes at which it's going to happen, and probably the service levels. So you might be thinking about what frequency do we see product being damaged, destroyed, lost, and therefore what does that imply about our choice of transport providers, and also the way that we need to think about product positioning and redundancy. So those are things that you're going to be taking your data sets on. And you're going to generally find that while the quality team will get very excited about this, the CFO can get quite anxious because they might hear a lot of things just telling, but there's going to be a good awareness of what the impact is of mitigating every single risk in a business. It can be very expensive. And so you also going to need to collect the cost data against this, so you can understand, well, what happens if we try and mitigate every single possible risk? You will end up with 3 times as much inventory. So then you start to be able to have a nuanced conversation around what is the appropriate level of risk as a business we want to take in order to supply our customers in the different segments we have, and what does that imply about our cost base? Can we tolerate that? Are we comfortable with it? Are we able to support it? Those are the kind of data sets you pull together to answer these questions.
Okay, very clear. Then maybe changing gear a little bit, if sort of visibility were the buzzword or the most talked about in 2022 in supply chains, I maybe think, at least for me, resilience is really what we talk about in 2023. And I also know your platform and product have been quite exciting simulation and stress testing and capabilities, which I think a lot of shippers right now and also logistics service providers like ourselves would be very interested to hear about.
Yeah, so resilience, I think, is a good natural evolution. I think a lot of people went through the process of having visibility and then watching themselves be unable to do very much about the pretty serious challenges we've had in the supply chains over the last few years. So the natural question becomes, well, how do I both anticipate where there might be challenges in my supply chain, test some scenarios that I might want to explore because I believe that they are the highest risk scenarios for me, and also alternatively take a view on where do I just have the greatest fragility? I.e., if we were to try and just break this network, break your supply chain, how would somebody trying to deliberately find weakness in your supply chain do that? And that's critical for understanding how resilient you are to different scenarios, and then being able to assign either probabilities that come from experience, or probabilities that come from external information, or just your own, intuition and expertise. But that's really important, because ultimately what you're trying to do from a resilience perspective is take a view on what balance risk you can tolerate to any one of the outcomes that you're trying to achieve. So if that's a revenue target, there are obvious things. What happens if we see a strike in a given location? How will that change my transport network? Will a 2-week delay in transport have a material impact on my ability to get my products to market? If it does, and it slips into the next financial year, is that a problem for me? Does that become a reporting issue because I'm going to a public market and telling the market, sorry, we're 2 weeks behind on revenue because we couldn't recognize it because it didn't turn up on time? Do I lose orders? So those kind of questions can be answered off the underlying data. That's a really important thing to test. But at the same time, you might not actually know where the greatest source of risk within your supply chain is, because it might be you just have a huge number of underlying correlated transport routes, and you actually have one huge concentration in the center of Europe through which all of your transport's going. And if that environment shuts down, not only is your revenue generation at risk, it may be that actually the ability to manufacture actually becomes also a problem for you. Yeah. So you could really see it like correlated risks.
And maybe just very low practically, how would I, as a user of your platform, actually work with those scenarios and stress testing or understanding these risks? How would I approach those questions, and how difficult is that?
Well, the good news is, by the time that our customers are talking to us about those kind of scenarios, all the data that's required for it is already kind of in the platform. So what they're typically starting to do is pose. There's two modes you can imagine doing it. One is you're posing scenarios, and you're saying, well, like I'd like to test this scenario. What happens if? And you can actually put that into the product itself, or our customer success team help coach our customers through how do we model this scenario for you? How do you use our software to do that? And then ultimately, that's sort of a question of configuration. You're trying to set up particular constraints, particular events, particular things you're trying to optimize towards your outcomes that you're focusing on, and you're letting the software do its thing. And there's the optimizer in the background, the AI in the background that's trying to work out, well, how would I best deal with this challenge? And then that will play back to you how it did deal with the challenge, and a few other ways that you could have. And so it'll sort of give you a kind of Google Maps like view of, this is your best path, here are a few others that you could explore doing if you wanted to. And then you can iterate that. And that's the critical thing, is you want to be able to, as you see the information coming back, as you see the response from these calculations from the AI, you actually don't want to just stop at that point. What you'll naturally start to see is, well, actually, that is an unacceptable outcome for my supply chain. What happens if I open a new get a transport provider on that lane? How much of an impact does that have? Or what would be the most impactful thing I could do to mitigate this risk? And that iteration is the critical step to go through.
Yeah, very interesting. Maybe if we just continue talking a little bit about AI and machine learning. I know you were one of the companies you're really building this in supply chain. When you were sitting across the shippers or LSPs and so on, what are really sort of the key things you are sort of telling senior stakeholders in different organizations they need to understand around AI and machine learning, how that will change supply chain management in sort of maybe the next 5 years? I think the evolution is going so fast. Yeah. That's maybe also a long time horizon, but what is really sort of the key takeaways from you?
the type of AI which we think is going to be most impactful to supply chains sits closer to what used to be kind of optimization and the things. And there's a real kind of, within the same framework, there's a real spectrum of technologies that can address optimization to different levels of accuracy and certainty and scalability. And so actually the critical thing to understand in supply chain context when you're talking about AI is that what you're really looking for is a blend of capability in the underlying technology, because you need a software solution that isn't just throwing one technology at the problem. It needs to be able to both have a framework to try different technologies and apply them, and switch between them and balance them at different levels of scale, because there is no panacea for this stuff. In some cases, the best answer is best achieved by letting a model run for a very long time and just brute forcing through all the different permutations. And in a lot of cases, that will be computationally infeasible. And so you need to be able to use a different technology that will approximate the same outcome and get you as close to it. The thing you're really trying to test for is ultimately, how does this perform versus a group of people doing it, and what's the trade-off that I get there? And to assess that, again, you're going to have to bring this back to your outcomes. You're going to have to start saying, well, baseline, how do I perform currently? How do I think I could perform in the future? Is that better? And actually, does the technology kind of stack up? But you need to be able to appreciate both things. You've got to have quite a data-driven view of the way to assess these technologies, and you really should be listening for what ability does the provider have to gradually and incrementally add new technologies to their deployments versus use any particular piece of jargon. For example, you hear neural networks or deep learning. It has to sit in context and it has to be used in a very specific use case. It should be one of many different technologies being deployed in the supply chain. If you don't hear evidence that there is a good blend and that is targeted to thinking holistically about the entire problem as opposed to being deployed into one narrow use case, then you do really need to dig a lot further.
Yeah. Okay, very interesting. Maybe a last question before we go into some smaller and more rapid questions. Sustainability and decarbonization, that's of course also one of our key investment focuses here in Maersk Growth. And I also know sort of decarbonization and sustainability is also some real platform enabled. Maybe you could just quickly cover that from your perspective and how you are working with that for your customers.
Yes, I think supply chains, logistics particularly within supply chain, is one of the great areas for trying to address this properly, because fundamentally there's an underlying physics problem which determines whether the alignment between cost and the alignment to carbon emissions is pretty closely correlated because of the underlying physics of mass transfer, basically, which removes something around the world. The more it moves, the more energy required to do that, the more fuel we consume, also the more costly it is in general. So there's really good correlations there already. The great thing about using your data, if you actually now can start to be very, very specific and accurate, both in terms of the costs and the carbon emissions that you're seeing for every single activity that you require, is you can actually find these amazing sweet spots where you can reduce both costs and carbon emissions really quite dramatically and achieve the same outcomes for a lot of businesses. So we talk about this. We have this concept of the green ratio, which is finding the optimal balance between your service levels, cost, and carbon emissions relative to your objectives. And we pretty consistently find for customers that is actually a win-win-win. This doesn't hit always an optimization point, but it actually suits all of them. This is something that businesses can do right now and is not dependent on a future technology to be deployed or a technology to be scaled out. And the time value of carbon is something we really think about. We love this concept. I think it's a really important way to think about things. Intervention now is both better for the planet now, for sure. But actually, if you're thinking about this purely from a business perspective, the impact of making rapid and complicated shifts later on, it's going to be vastly more expensive than making gradual and incremental improvements now. This is one of the ones that you can make right away. It's an optimization that's out there. It's mathematically complex, but operationally simple to achieve. So that's why we love this. We think it's a great opportunity for nearly every business in the world that has any transport component to it to start making a real dent in their carbon footprint without putting a dent in their P&L.
Yeah, no, fully agree, and I think it's a very good way to look at it. Then maybe jumping into some smaller questions where you just give some whatever come to your mind. And
sure.
Maybe if we start, what is your best advice to new founders going into supply chain tech?
Go and spend time in the supply chain, physically visit sites, go to warehouses, go to ports, train stations, anything, depots, cross-docking facilities, go to your customers' manufacturing sites, get inside them, go and watch them operate, because what you'll find, what I found is a huge number of really, really good people pedaling very, very hard to try and keep things running well. And the complexity of what they're facing and the variety of people you'll find in there is enormous. It's just at times really overwhelming. But you have to understand it, because if you think this is not a simple technology solution, you can't just throw technology at the problem and expect it to suddenly fix things. There's true, real on the ground complexity in every dimension, whether it's the actual underlying products we're shipping or the people that you've got to work with. They vary hugely. Think about the type of variety of users that you see in a store, or a warehouse. You've got everybody from a teenager who's working on their summer holidays to sometimes a 60-year-old who's just earning some extra cash on the way to retirement. Imagine the difference in their accessibility requirements, their eyesight quality. There's so many different things that you have to be able to get your head around and build for and work for those people.
Yeah, no, make a lot of sense. Then if not 7bridges, what would be sort of the next or another supply chain problem you would work on?
That's a very good question. Well, I think one of the areas I do really, really like is the scalability of kind of manufacturing. So there's a lot of manufacturing examples where the question is not just the degree to which you can produce the products and reliability of it, but also the degree to which you can scale it up. So we've seen that obviously in healthcare in the last few years. How do you do a rapid scale out of any given piece of product? And that's true in actually quite a few different concepts and verticals. That's something for me that I'd really love to go and tackle and see what could be achieved to change that.
Yeah, no, that's also definitely an interesting area. Then the ChatGPT and diffusion models. How will this impact logistics? And that's even something we need to think about.
Yeah, I think when diffusion models, as I said, like the kind of blended technologies out there will change. As you start to incorporate them all, they will change the overall experience significantly. I think things like ChatGPT, the actual impact on logistics at a deep level will be fairly limited. I think that it will have massive implications for knowledge management, and I think it'll have massive implications for the way that you could imagine interacting with an operations system or a planning system. The power of those models at their core could completely transform what we take to be a standard and high quality user interface and make them unimaginably different. So I think that there's huge broad applicability across the supply chain. I don't think they're going to, on their own, change very much in terms of the way that supply chains run, but they will certainly be part of the overall landscape that needs to be incorporated, and technology that needs to be incorporated to change, for example, accessibility.
Yeah, no, I think that was a very good and nuanced answer. Then maybe the last question to your sort of a personal view, are there anywhere sort of around supply chain tech or logistics where you have a contrarian view, or where sort of you're going against sort of what people are thinking on aggregate?
So I think there's probably one where we really have a fairly contrarian view. So one of the things that we don't believe in within supply chain at all is rules-based thinking. So it's one of our observations is that one of the perceived premium ways of dealing with anything within supply chain is having a lot of automation, a lot of rules, and having people think about those rules and apply them. We actually think those are really dangerous. I mean, rules as a whole tend to be pretty brittle, and they're quite hard to diagnostically understand when something's going wrong and the rule isn't a good idea anymore. So the only way to really test that is to change the rule and see what happens. And so we think about this from a completely different perspective. We think about this in terms of how do you set your objectives and then set constraints and then optimize towards your objectives within a constraint, which I think is actually going to change. We think it's going to change the way that supply chain managers would interact with the supply chain, because it will move from setting explicit, this is what should happen, if this then that statements, to I'm trying to achieve this. I want to make sure that I put good guide rails around my system and around what options are possible. And that's going to come from my learning and experience and the kind of intuition that actually is very difficult to build out of data. Context that sits outside any information that you could find in the data anyway. But once you put those in, those kind of constraints, you really want to let machines do the work, basically. We find that that's a pretty contrarian position. Most people still believe in the power of rules and are point is that high complexity systems rules are very, very dangerous.
Yeah, no, I could imagine. Now actually you inspired me to ask one last question, so I hope that's okay. What are you most excited about, or what should we be most excited about coming from 7bridges in 2023?
Well, I mean, we've got some really exciting product rollouts. That's one that's just actually come out. Probably shouldn't spoil our product team's announcement, but the latest sort of release on our simulations layer is just an incredible step forward in terms of both explainability, so being able to actually understand the way that the AI has generated recommendations for you, which we think is hugely important because opaque systems are high. It's really, really powerful, but also just much more human to use if you can understand what it's recommending and then other things that might affected that recommendation. I think the other thing is what we're going to start seeing is just a lot more variable, kind of balancing within businesses, cost, carbon emissions, service level agreements, and so on. All of those coming together. That's another thing we're really excited to see deployed into a large, really, really the biggest companies in the world, being able to balance those kind of outcomes at quite a granular level, right down to the product and the customer channel if you wanted to. Yeah. We think that could be hugely, hugely impactful for those businesses in the short term on their carbon footprint, on their P&Ls, but also actually for their end customer and consumer outcomes.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect note to end at. So thanks a lot for being here and talking to us. I thought it was super, super interesting. I'm sure our listeners will as well. So thanks a lot, Phil, and good luck in 2023.
Thanks very much. Great to be.
And with that brings us to the end of an exciting episode of the Maersk Growth Podcast. For us to keep developing, we would love to hear your feedback and suggestions for future episodes. So please feel free to reach out to us at growth@maersk.com or through LinkedIn. If you found this podcast valuable, please consider subscribing to it at your favorite podcast platform and leave us a review and rating. Thanks for listening, and until next time, keep exploring.